The hard drive burns in my palm. Proof I didn't steal billions from NexaCore. My own encryption key framed me, and only one man could access it. Rain slashes my face as I sprint through Chicago streets, the city screaming for my arrest. They're coming. I have 30 seconds before the ambush hits. And the man who raised me just signed my death warrant. The key card's in my pocket, the server room my only shot. But the scaffolding groans above me. One wrong step, and I'm buried under steel. My name's Marcus Thorne, and tonight I either disappear or they erase me for good. Rainwater licked the collar of Marcus's wool coat, heavy with the metallic tang of Chicago pavement. He ducked into the cafe, the sudden silence of the interior pressing against his ringing ears. Steam from an espresso machine hissed, masking the frantic rhythm of his pulse. Sarah Johnson and David Miller sat huddled in a corner booth, their faces sculpted by the amber glow of a single low-hanging lamp. The air in the shop smelled of burnt beans and damp upholstery, a sharp contrast to the biting wind outside. Marcus slid into the vinyl seat, the material cracking beneath his weight like a warning. He placed the encrypted drive on the scarred mahogany table, but his hand lingered on the plastic casing, his fingernail tapping the smooth riverstone in his pocket. Click, 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 click. The drive stays with me until the wire clears, Marcus whispered. His voice rasped, dry as parchment. He watched the blur of headlights smear across the glass window, feeling the weight of the city pressing in. Sarah reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the drive. Her eyes, usually bright with a fixer's determination, were shadowed with fatigue. David Miller, the jittery IT assistant from NexaCore, sat across from them, his hands flying to his neck to perform the three-pull tie ritual. Tug, tug, tug. We discussed the terms, Marcus. David stammered, his voice jumping an octave. The firm won't wait. They're already scrubbing the logs. If we don't move the data now, there won't be anything left to prove your innocence. Marcus tightened his grip on the stone. The firm owns the police, David. I've seen how Sterling operates. He doesn't delete files. He rewrites history. If this data leaks before I have a bridge to the feds, we disappear. If it stays, we burn. David leaned forward, the scent of stale coffee and nervous sweat trailing him. He fumbled in his pocket and produced a slim, silver keycard. It caught the amber light, a jagged tooth of plastic and silicon. This is the master bypass for the North Loop server farm, David whispered, sliding it across the wood. It's the only way to get the raw traffic logs. The drive you have. It's just the encryption key. You need the physical handshake to unlock the truth. The exchange felt like a heavy anchor dropping into the deep. As Marcus's fingers brushed the cold plastic of the key card, the bell above the cafe door chimed, a sharp, tinny sound that cut through the hiss of the espresso machine. Two men in charcoal overcoats stepped inside. They didn't look for a table. They didn't look at the menu. Their eyes locked onto the corner booth with the predatory focus of wolves. Move, Marcus hissed. The cafe exploded into motion. The kidnappers didn't shout. They moved with a silent, professional efficiency that was far more terrifying. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the kitchen door as the first man reached into his coat. The smell of ozone and wet wool filled the narrow hallway. They burst through the swinging doors, past a startled cook, and into the alleyway where the rain turned the world into a gray smear. This way, Marcus shouted over the roar of a passing elevated train. The screech of metal on metal vibrated through his teeth. They scrambled over piles of discarded crates, the heavy thud of boots behind them growing louder. The kidnappers were gaining, their silhouettes cutting through the fog like ghosts. Marcus led them toward the skeletal remains of a half-finished high-rise, a jagged tooth of steel and concrete looming over the Chicago River. The construction site was a maze of shadows and whistling wind. Marcus's lungs burned, the air tasting of grit and wet cement. He looked up, seeing the yellow tricycle perched on the 32nd floor, a haunting, silent witness. He knew this site. He'd mapped the digital security for the builders months ago. He knew the weak points. "Up the ramp," he yelled to Sarah and David. They scrambled onto the temporary wooden walkway, the boards groaning under their weight. Below, the kidnappers entered the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. Marcus stopped at a heavy steel winch, his fingers flying to the release lever. He didn't need a computer for this. He needed gravity. With a grunt of exertion, he kicked the locking pin. The scream of unspooling wire rope was deafening, a high-pitched wail that echoed off the surrounding towers. A massive pallet of steel rebar, suspended 30 feet in the air, groaned and then plummeted. It hit the scaffolding with the force of a falling moon. The sound was a tectonic shift, the screech of twisting iron, the thunder of splintering wood, and the wet thud of debris hitting the mud. A cloud of dust and pulverized plaster erupted, smelling of ancient earth and pulverized stone. The kidnappers disappeared beneath the wreckage, their shouts cut short by the roar of the collapse. Marcus didn't wait to see if they crawled out. He grabbed Sarah's hand and vanished into the labyrinth of the city, the keycard pressed hard against his palm. Hours later, tucked into the corner of a 24-hour laundromat that smelled of bleach and scorched lint, Marcus slid the stolen drive into a battered laptop. His fingers trembled as he navigated the directories. The screen flickered, casting a sickly blue glow over his tired face. He wasn't looking for the money. He was looking for the ghost. He found it in the metadata of the frame-up, a sequence of commands that looked like his own handwriting, his private encryption key, a digital thumbprint he'd kept locked in a vault only he and Robert Sterling could access. He did it, Marcus whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. Sterling didn't just let them frame me. He wrote the code himself. The betrayal tasted like copper in his mouth. Robert Sterling, the man who had plucked Marcus from a dead-end desk job and called him son, had used Marcus's own genius to pull the trigger. The Sterling rotation of white shirts wasn't just about order. It was about the absolute removal of any stain. And Marcus was the stain Sterling was currently bleaching out of existence. "We have to go to the safe house," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she clutched her leather-bound ledger of receipts. "We have the logs now, Marcus. We have the proof." But the safe house wasn't safe. When they arrived at the small apartment in Lincoln Park, the door was already ajar, the lock hanging limp like a broken limb. The air inside didn't smell like the lavender air freshener they'd left behind. It smelled of cold, damp earth. Marcus stepped inside, his heart thudding against his ribs. On the mantel, where a photo of him and Sarah once stood, there was a new image. It was a blown-up surveillance shot of Sarah, taken only minutes ago at the laundromat. Her eyes had been meticulously cut out with a razor blade, leaving two black voids that seemed to stare through the room. Marcus felt the world tilt. Sterling wasn't just following them. He was playing with them. The digital walls were closing in, and the city he had once mastered was now a cage designed by his mentor. The next morning, the city of Chicago woke up to Marcus Thorne's face on every digital billboard from O'Hare to the Navy Pier. The FBI had frozen his accounts, turning his life into a series of access-denied prompts. He was a ghost with a bounty, a man whose very existence was being deleted in real time. "We need a public terminal," Marcus told Sarah as they huddled under a bridge, the smell of diesel and old fish clinging to their hair. I can't use my gear. They're tracking the hardware signatures. I need a clean pipe, something old, something buried in the noise. They found a dusty terminal in the basement of a transit hub, a relic of an older era. The hum of the cooling fans was a low-frequency vibration that rattled Marcus's teeth. He began the upload, the progress bar crawling forward with agonizing slowness. "Come on," he hissed, his fingernail tapping the stone. Click, 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 click. Thorne. The voice was like gravel over velvet, but it didn't belong to Sterling. It was Agent James Wilson, a man whose cheap suit smelled of stale coffee and whose knuckles popped with a rhythmic pop, pop, pop as he rounded the corner. He wasn't alone. A dozen agents flooded the terminal room, their boots echoing like hammer blows on the concrete. "Step away from the machine, Marcus," Wilson said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "You're making this very difficult for everyone." Marcus didn't step away. He lunged for a heavy industrial cable hanging from a junction box. The copper core was exposed, humming with the power of 1,000 lights. As Wilson reached for his holster, Marcus jammed the cable into the electronic lock of the heavy steel door. A spark erupted, bright as a dying star. The smell of scorched dust filled the room as the surge tore through the building's nervous system. The lights died, replaced by the jarring red pulse of the emergency strobes. The electronic locks slammed shut with a heavy, final clack, trapping Wilson and his team inside the terminal room. Marcus bolted into the maintenance tunnels, the darkness swallowing him whole. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, navigating by touch through the labyrinth of pipes and wires. He reached a secure junction box, his fingers finding the familiar braille of the hardware. With a few quick taps, he bypassed the Aegis protocol's local sensors, a temporary patch that turned him into a shadow in the machine. In the silence of the tunnels, he finally opened the hidden layer of the Aegis files he'd pulled from the drive. He expected to find a surveillance tool, a way for Sterling to peek into government secrets. What he found was far worse. Aegis wasn't a shield. It was a Trojan horse. It was designed to sit quietly in the heart of the national infrastructure, waiting for a single command to turn off the lights, the water, and the communications of the entire country. Sterling wasn't looking for a seat at the table. He was looking to own the room. "He's going to flip the switch," Marcus whispered to the darkness. "And he's going to use my name to do it." The deadline was 60 minutes away. The national rollout of Aegis was scheduled for the top of the hour, a security update that would hand the keys of the kingdom to a madman. And then the phone in Marcus's pocket buzzed. It was a video file. No text, just a grainy shot of Sarah sitting in a white-on-white room, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, a silver-haired man adjusted a perfect white shirt. "Marcus," Sterling's voice came through the tiny speaker, smooth as silk. "Families shouldn't keep secrets. Come to the garage on 4th. Let's finish our story." Marcus called the only person he thought he could still trust. Jennifer Brown, his lawyer. She had been with him since the beginning, a walls-up woman who spoke in the melodic tones of a funeral dirge. "Jennifer, I have the logs," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I have the proof of the Trojan horse. I need an injunction. I need a judge who isn't on the payroll." "I have someone, Marcus," Jennifer replied, her humming, "Nearer, my God, to thee," drifting over the line. "Meet me at the parking garage. I'll have the papers ready. We can end this." Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Marcus felt a surge of cold, analytical relief. Contacting Jennifer was the only logical move left on the board. She was a powerhouse in the Chicago legal scene, a woman whose reputation for integrity was as sharp as her suits. Marcus knew the FBI was compromised by Wilson, and the police were Sterling's personal guard. But the judiciary remained a separate pillar. Jennifer had the connections to bypass the local field offices and go straight to a federal magistrate. He checked his watch, sinking it one last time, and felt the weight of the stone in his pocket. He had the decrypted drive, the key card, and now the legal firepower to back it up. He would hand the evidence to Jennifer, she would secure the injunction, and Sarah would be released as part of the legal fallout. It was a clean, surgical strike. Phase 2. False positive. He arrived at the 4th Street parking garage, a vast concrete cavern that smelled of damp stone and exhaust. Jennifer was waiting by her black sedan, her arms crossed in her signature armor pose. When she saw him, her face softened. She stepped forward, breaking her 4-foot rule to place a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Marcus," she whispered. "I've already briefed Judge Miller. He's waiting at his residence. Once I have that drive, the Aegis rollout will be halted by a national stay." Marcus felt the tension drain from his spine. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in 48 hours, he took a full, deep breath. The air tasted of ozone, but it felt like victory. He reached into his coat and handed her the silver drive. "Save her, Jennifer," he said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the dim overhead lights. "I will." Phase 3. The crack, Jennifer turned toward her car, but she didn't open the driver's side door. She walked to the trunk and began to hum. It was the dirge, the low, mournful melody of "Nearer, my God, to Thee." Marcus froze. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, a chilling, rhythmic vibration. He noticed her posture. It wasn't the weary stance of a protector. It was the rigid, triumphant stance of a predator who had finally closed the trap. Then he saw the reflection in the sedan's polished window. A pair of headlights flickered on at the far end of the level. Not one pair. 3. The silent, black SUVs he had seen at the cafe. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The world tilted on its axis as Robert Sterling stepped out of the lead vehicle, his silver hair gleaming like a blade. Jennifer didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply walked over to Sterling and handed him the drive. "The architecture is complete, Robert," she said, her voice devoid of its previous warmth. Marcus lunged forward, but 2 guards appeared from the shadows behind the concrete pillars, pinning his arms behind his back with bone-crushing force. "Jennifer." Marcus gasped, the betrayal hitting him harder than any physical blow. "Oh, Marcus," she sighed, the humming continuing beneath her words. "You always were so focused on the code that you forgot to look at the architects. I didn't just help Sterling. I built the legal framework that makes Aegis untouchable. You didn't bring me evidence to stop him. You brought me the last copy of the logs so we could burn them." Sterling walked over, his unblinking eyes fixed on Marcus. He took the drive, placed it on the concrete floor, and brought his heel down. The sound of crushing plastic and shattering silicon was small, but to Marcus, it sounded like a funeral bell. "You were a brilliant tool, Marcus," Sterling said, leaning into his personal space. "But tools eventually dull." Jennifer was right about the suicide note, by the way. It's quite moving. A brilliant man, driven to the edge by his own paranoia, finally ending it all on the bridge. Jennifer stepped forward, a needle glinting in her hand. "Don't fight it, Marcus. It's just a sedative." "We need you quiet for the drive to the river." The needle bit into his neck. A wave of cold fire surged through his veins, and the world began to dissolve into a gray, featureless haze. He had handed the keys to the very people who wanted to lock the door. Sarah was still a prisoner, the evidence was dust, and his own lawyer was the one pulling the shroud over his head. As he was shoved into the back of the sedan, the last thing he heard was Jennifer's humming, a soft, melodic promise of the end. The sedan moved through the Chicago night, a silent coffin on wheels. Marcus fought the fog in his brain, his fingers twitching toward the stone in his pocket. He couldn't reach it. His muscles felt like lead, his vision a blurred smear of city lights. But his mind, the analytical, surgical engine that had defined his life, refused to shut down. He felt the car hit a bump, the vibration traveling through the frame. He knew this road, the rhythmic thump-thump of the expansion joints. They were on the bridge. He forced his hand to move, an inch at a time, toward the underside of the dashboard. He had spent years studying the internal systems of these luxury sedans for a security audit. He knew there was a diagnostic port, a back door for mechanics, that bypassed the primary security layers. His fingers found the port. It was cold, jagged metal. He didn't have a computer, but he had the keycard David had given him, the master bypass. It wasn't meant for a car, but the architecture of the Aegis protocol was universal. He jammed the card into the port, his mind screaming for the connection to hold. Click. The car's internal computer shrieked, a high-pitched digital scream that filled the cabin. The dashboard lights flickered wildly, and then, with a sound like a shotgun blast, the emergency airbags deployed. The white nylon balloons exploded into the faces of the guards in the front seat, their shouts of surprise cut short by the impact. The car swerved, the tires screeching against the bridge deck. Marcus used the momentum to throw himself against the door, falling out of the moving vehicle and onto the cold, wet pavement. He tumbled, the world spinning in a blur of gray and black. He came to rest against the iron girder of the bridge, the smell of salt and diesel filling his lungs. He crawled toward the emergency phone box, his movements slow and agonizing. Subverted. Phase 1. Smart decision. Marcus reached the phone. He didn't dial 911. He knew the police were Wilson's. Instead, he pulled a small hidden burner phone from his boot, the one thing they hadn't found. He had a logic bomb sitting on a remote server, a piece of code he'd written years ago as a fail-safe. It was designed to trigger a total transparency event. If he could just link the burner to the bridge's network, he could activate the bomb. It would pull every private log, every recorded conversation from Sterling's private cloud, and broadcast it to every news outlet in the world. It was the ultimate nuclear option. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He would record his own confession, here on the bridge, and attach it to the data dump. The truth would be undeniable. Phase 2. False positive. He patched the phone into the bridge's maintenance line. The connection was solid. "This is Marcus Thorne," he whispered into the mic, his voice rasping. "I am on the Chicago River Bridge. Robert Sterling and Jennifer Brown are the architects of the Aegis Trojan horse. Here is the proof." He hit the send button. He watched the progress bar fill up. 10%, 50%, 100%. Sent. He leaned back against the cold iron, a bloody smile on his face. He had done it. He had bypassed the killers, the corrupt cops, and the treacherous lawyer. The world was about to see Sterling for the monster he was. He heard the sirens in the distance, the real police surely, coming to investigate the crash. He had won. Phase 3. The crack. He looked down at his burner phone to watch the news feeds. He expected to see breaking news banners and Sterling's face. Instead, The screen stayed black. Then, a single line of text appeared. Signal intercepted. Redirecting to private server. Marcus's heart stopped. He checked the connection. It wasn't the bridge network. It was a localized spoofing signal, a honeypot designed to catch any outgoing data from this specific location. He looked up. A small black drone was hovering 50 feet above the bridge, its red eye blinking. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The sirens weren't the real police. They were Wilson's men, arriving to clean up the mess. And the logic bomb? It hadn't gone to the news. It had gone straight to Sterling's encrypted vault, giving him the only remaining copy of the evidence Marcus had been hiding. Sterling stepped out of a car that had pulled up behind the crash, unruffled, his white shirt perfect. He held up a tablet, showing Marcus the upload. "Thank you for the delivery, Marcus," Sterling said, his voice a low gravel. "We've been looking for that logic bomb for months. You just gave us the last piece of the puzzle. Now, there is no one left who can stop the rollout. And your confession? We'll edit that. It'll make a wonderful suicide note." Marcus realized with a sickening clarity that his smart failsafe had been the final key Sterling needed to seal the Trojan horse. By trying to expose them, he had handed them the final lock. He was battered, paralyzed by the fading sedative, and now he had personally ensured the conspiracy's success. He watched as Wilson approached, his knuckles popping, pop, 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 ready to finish the job. Marcus was no longer a threat. He was a loose thread being tucked away. But then, the world changed one last time. A shadow stepped out from behind Wilson's van. It was David Miller, the jittery assistant. But he wasn't jittery anymore. He wasn't pulling his tie. He held a heavy professional camera in one hand and a federal badge in the other. "Actually, Robert," David said, his voice steady and cold, "I think the suicide note is going to have to wait." Behind David, a fleet of black SUVs, real ones with the flashing lights of the Department of Justice, swarmed the bridge. "David Miller, Corporate Audit Division," David said, nodding to Marcus. "I've been recording this entire conversation from the moment you stepped out of the car, Sterling. The drone? That's mine. The spoofing signal? Also mine. We didn't need Marcus's logic bomb to catch you. We just needed you to admit to the kidnapping on tape." The arrest was swift and silent. Sterling didn't shout. He simply turned and allowed the cuffs to click, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Jennifer Brown was found a block away, her humming finally silenced by the cold reality of a federal cage. Weeks later, the mist of the Pacific Northwest clung to the towering pines, a soft gray blanket that made the world feel small and quiet. Marcus stood on the shoreline, the sound of the waves a rhythmic, healing pulse. He wasn't a genius anymore. He wasn't a master of the machine. He was just a man with a stone in his pocket. Sarah walked up behind him, her hand sliding into his. She didn't have her ledger. She didn't have her receipts. She just had him. "Is it over?" she asked. Marcus looked out at the water, his fingernail tapping the stone. Click, 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 click. He waited 5 seconds. Then he took the stone and threw it into the gray void of the ocean. "The system is patched," he said. "Let's go home." He was a ghost now. His fortune gone, his name a footnote in a conspiracy that had almost swallowed the world. But as the wind sighed through the needles, Marcus Thorne realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a back door. He was finally, truly free.